When my dad stopped running, we were in an old hotel perched on a hill above one of the many lakes in the north of England. The argument had been a bad one, and it had lasted the entire weekend. Closeted in my room, I stayed out of the way and listened with only partial interest. By now I could chart the flow of my parents' flights, predicting their tidal peaks and troughs with an accuracy that had become boring. My mother's strident shrieks would eventually give way to a sullen, pointed silence. My dad's contained reasonableness would last for a while, before cracking like dropped china. There would be insults and bitterness, and finally either a teary reconciliation or my dad would flee. It had been this way for as long as I could remember, and it no longer really bothered me. I sometimes felt as though it ought to upset me, but I had long since stopped being worried by the things I heard or saw. My parents' arguments were like other parents' dinner parties, an infrequent inconvenience. The aftermath of the argument was as predictable as the argument itself. Dad met me as I came out from school on Monday afternoon. "We're going away for a few days, son," he said to me, after giving me a long, tight hug. "Your mum and me, we haven't been getting along so well this weekend. You might have heard," he said with a rueful smile. "So I thought we could give her a little space and have some time together, make up for the weekend. What do you say?" I did not ask where we were going, as I knew that Dad wouldn't know. He never planned, simply went. Previously we had taken short trips to the zoo and the cinema, and sometimes longer overnight stays with my grandparents or friends. My dad's running was less about escape, I think, than about showing my mother that he could still act without her. The worse the argument, the further he ran and the longer he stayed away, making his point with our absence. It also meant that he avoided further arguments. On our return, my mother would often act as though the fight had never happened, be pleased to see us, and shower my dad with kisses. She never tried to contact us while we were away, as far as I know. She just seemed to enjoy her time without us. Once I heard her say to my father, "Thank you for taking him away, George. Time to be by myself does me so much good." For me, at least, the flight, and the attendant adventures it provided, was always better than returning. We arrived at Forest Lodge late at night, after a journey that had started on a train, moved on to a local bus service, and ended with us walking perhaps 2 miles along dark country lanes. We had only 2 bags between us, and from the feel of them neither was full. I wondered about how efficient my dad's packing had been, but was too excited to care. I assumed that Dad would sort us out when we got there. It was what he did. My mother, on the other hand, spent hours packing for even the smallest of trips, checking and rechecking the contents of the bags and planting things in their depths for all sorts of eventualities. Our room was large and panelled in dark wood. A great stone and slate mantel covered the length of one wall, with a fireplace set at its centre. The room smelled faintly of polish and age and wood smoke. 2 beds were set either side of a floor-to-ceiling window, and a sofa, bulging with old stuffing, pressed against the far wall. It was a nice room. My dad had paid a lot for it, I knew, so that we could have some luxury on our break. As an added treat, the bathroom had, in addition to the toilet and sink, an old claw-footed bath that looked big enough to swim in. Its taps were great brass crosses, the white enamel panels in their centre decorated with ornate letters for hot and cold. I, and I suspect my dad, had never stayed in a room like it before. By the time we were shown to the room I was more tired than I could ever remember being, and despite my excitement only managed to strip to my underwear before getting into one of the beds. It was comfortable in a way that my bed at home was not. hugging itself around me with a lightness that drew me into sleep almost instantly. I did not sleep well, however. Dad was restless, and his pacing woke me several times. He walked around the room in the near darkness, talking very quietly to himself, a rapid whisper in which I could make out no words, only his tone. That he was still upset about the argument was obvious, but I wished that he would keep his misery and anger quieter. My last memory from that night is of being woken by a figure, pale in the gloom, standing at the end of my bed and staring at me. I guessed that it was Dad, stripped for bed, making a final check on me. I woke early, despite my disturbed night's sleep. The sun was slicing in through the windows and pinning the furniture to the floor with its intensity. Winter sun has always been my favourite, low and bright and powerful, and I enjoyed the sight of it. The shadows it created were magnificent, black and sharp and deep. The crosses formed by the window frames lay across the carpet, quartering the patches of light, and I made a game of jumping from patch to patch on my way to the bathroom. After I had finished, I went to the windows and looked out. In the near distance the sun glittered on the lake, and its surrounding fringe of trees waved gently in a breeze that I could not feel. In the distance, fields crawled up the sides of the Lake District hills, whose green and grey sides stood against a sky as blue as any I had ever seen. Closer, a single road passed the hotel, a quiet black strip that wound its way through the green fields and continued, out of sight, up the nearest slope. Everything looked fresh and clean. I found myself thinking it was a shame that Dad hadn't been able to bring my mother along with us. No one, I felt, would be able to argue in a place like this. I managed to rouse Dad long enough for him to take me down to breakfast, but he brought me back to the room straight afterwards. He told me to amuse myself and went back to bed, falling asleep quickly, and I knew that he would not rise again for hours. I had seen this before, too. The energy that my parents spent on arguing would exhaust them, and afterwards they would rest for hours, doing little other than sleeping or reading. I wondered briefly about making lots of noise in the hope that it would force Dad to wake up, but dismissed the idea. Woken before he wanted to be, he could be short-tempered and difficult. Instead, I spent the morning looking around the room whilst I unpacked our bags, finding things that I had not seen the night before. There were sets of drawers either side of the beds, complete with battered Gideon Bibles, and a wardrobe pushed into a corner. On one wall was a painting of a woman. She was young and pretty and dressed in a white floating gown that billowed around her. In the background of the painting was a building that I thought might be Forest Lodge itself. Looking more closely, I saw a little plaque attached to the frame that read, "Charlotte Rose, 1900 to 19." She had been only 6 years older than me when she died. Shaking my head at how someone could possibly have died so young, I carried on with my sorting. I put underwear in drawers, finding in the process that Dad had brought me lots of pants but only 2 pairs of socks, and hung shirts in the small wardrobe. Doing this was fun in a strange way. I felt as if I was unpeeling secrets, handling things I did not normally get to handle. Dad's shaving kit, a razor, brush and soapstick in a wooden case that had originally belonged to his grandfather, was something I did not often see, but I had the chance to examine it in detail as I was putting it in the bathroom. I marvelled at how Dad's stubble had slightly worn the blade's edge, how the new blades in their wax-paper wrapper shifted when I touched them. I smelled the soap, a rich aroma that made me think of Dad's skin and of cuddles and the times I was closest to him. The velvet lining of the box was worn and stained, yet it felt more precious to me than anything else I had held. It was as I was putting Dad's shaving kit and our other toiletries in the bathroom that I decided to have a bath. Not a quick splash with the water up to my hips, as I generally had at home, but a proper bath. with the water so deep I could float, and so hot it would appear to be smoking. I would allow myself some luxury, as Dad had put it, soaking in the water until I pruned. Delighted with the idea, I started filling the bath straight away. Steam soon filled the room, its dark wood fittings glistening with moisture, and the light above disappearing in a swirling mist and leaving only a faded glow showing through the water droplets. The liquid flowing from the taps was clear, and I imagined that it came straight from the lake itself. The noise of it running seemed to swell and fill the room, and I was soon surrounded by noise and the dancing reflections that moved glittering across the walls. Stripping, I turned the flow off and lowered myself into the water. Once I got over the shock of how hot it was, I enjoyed the bath hugely. I liked the way I could stretch out, and my feet still did not touch the far end of the old tub, and the way in which I could almost float in its depths. Sweat trickled down my forehead and temples as I relaxed, and began to let myself daydream. I have no idea how long I had been there, when I heard the person at the bathroom door. Feet shuffled in the main room. It was a light step, as though the person was trying to move around as silently as possible. I sat up, thinking it might be Dad, but his sleeping breathing, just audible, had not changed. The bathroom door was almost shut, with only a couple of inches of light showing in a strip between it and the frame. Through the misted air, I saw someone pass in front of the light. It was definitely not Dad. I wanted to call out, ask who it was, but did not want to draw attention to myself. The figure had looked female, and I was naked. There were more delicate steps, and then the creak of the door as it moved slowly. It swung open another couple of inches, and a hand appeared in the gap, wrapping around the edge of the door. The fingers were long, slim, and pale, and streaked with dirt. One of the nails was bent back to reveal the quick underneath, red and angry looking. The door opened another inch, and now I could see a woman, framed in the gap. She was dressed in white, although, like her fingers, the clothes were streaked with dirt, and were also ragged. The lower hem of her dress was torn and uneven above her pale calves and bare feet, and it was pulled up high and wrapped around her head. Only one eye was visible, and this was set back amongst folds of cloth and lost in shadow. I wanted to speak, but could not. My heart beat hard in my chest, and my throat felt constricted and dry. She made no sound as she looked at me. Her attention was absolute, and I felt pinned by it, unable even to cry. The woman took a step into the bathroom, moving through the rapidly clearing mist. Where the steam touched her, it whirled and vanished, as though it was being sucked into her through her skin. I saw her more clearly as she came closer, her shadowed eye glaring at me. I wanted to flee, but where could I go? I was in a bath, with solid walls behind. I felt the bath-water chill around me, as though its heat was leaking away, and goose-flesh broke out across my exposed arms and chest. The woman reached her arms out towards me. She took another step, and I had time to notice that her legs were encrusted with deposits of black grime that swirled across her skin and nestled down into the cracks between her toes, and that she was leaving brown streaks across the wet floor as she moved. Then the hands were only inches from me. Her fingers stretched out, revealing palms covered in tiny cuts, weeping blood that glistened thickly. Still I could not make a sound. The woman's legs bumped against the side of the bath, and her dress flapped over the water, small sprinkles of dirt falling to the surface of the liquid and dissolving. I saw that the dress was actually a sheet wrapped around her, clinging to her flesh, and seemingly stuck there by the dried dirt. I looked up at her, ready to beg, and caught a glimpse of her eye, lost in the shrouding material. It was fixed on my face with a desperate intensity, almost glowing in its darkness. There was no steam left in the air, and the bath-water had become incredibly cold as the woman's questing hands came towards me. I yelped involuntarily and jerked away. Slipping, I splashed under the water for a second, and resurfaced coughing and trying to clear my eyes so that I might avoid the woman again. I think I may have cried out then. The woman was gone. From the next room I heard Dad call to me, his voice thick. Weeping, I called back to him. Dad ran into the bathroom a moment later. His hair was corkscrewed about his face by sleep, tufts popping out from behind his ears and across his crown. He stood in the doorway, looking around wildly, and then saw me in the bath. I cried steadily, pulling myself to the side of the tub and holding one arm out to him as though I were drowning and asking for assistance. The light glittered on the drops of water that dotted my arm. Then Dad was kneeling next to me and wrapping me in a hug that was warm and safe. "Simon, what's wrong?" he asked, finally pulling back from me a little. His dark blue pyjama top had got wet, and the patches looked black and oozing. I cried fiercely, my chest hitching and wrenching as I tried to ease the fear I had felt. Dad simply pulled me into another hug and held me. Finally I managed to control my tears. Dad let go of me and spoke, his voice kind. "What's wrong, son? Why are you crying?" He was looking at me, his face still bearing the scars of the pillow it had been pressed into minutes before. He looked suddenly old and careworn, and the tired flesh under his eyes was as dark as I had ever seen it. "Son, talk to me. You're freezing. The bath-water's cold. Why are you in a cold bath?" He lifted me out and, pulling a towel off the rail behind him, held it open before him. I stepped into another embrace, this one clouded with cotton and the smell of fresh washing. I shivered, and Dad rubbed at me through the towel. He had not had to dry me for years, not since I had become old enough to feel uncomfortable being nude near him. Yet now I let myself be taken care of like a child. Drawn by his comfort, I told him what had happened. Dad listened without interruption until I had finished, and then turned me around to look at the bath-water. "There's no dirt in it, son," he said softly. "Look at the floor. It's clean. No footprints or mud. I think you got into a hot bath and relaxed, and you were more tired than you thought. It's been a long weekend, and you fell asleep and dreamed of the woman in the picture." I wanted to disagree, but couldn't. He was right. The floor was clean and bright, the bath-water clear. Looking at the door's edge, I could see no sign that anyone had touched it. "You have to be careful in water, son. It's dangerous. You could have drowned. Look at your fingers and toes, they've gone all wrinkled. You must have been in there for ages." I wanted to tell Dad that he was wrong, that I had seen the woman, that she had seemed so real, that she could not have been my imagination. But he had already turned away and gone back into the bedroom. Dad and I spent the afternoon exploring the area around Forest Lodge. Between it and the lake were lots of small roads and tracks dotted with shops. We ate lunch in a tiny cafe, and then Dad bought us both outdoor clothes from a camping and hiking shop close to the lake. I enjoyed these treats, but both times when he paid, I saw that the look on his face was one of anger, and I knew that the argument with my mother had been about money. Dad was spending to get back at her, and the generosity of his gifts was in direct proportion to the ferocity of the preceding fight. After buying the clothes, we walked along the water's edge, me kicking at pebbles and Dad silent, carrying bags that pulled his shoulders into a stoop. Lagging behind him, I stared at the trees that ringed the lake. They were in constant movement, bending and straightening from the touch of distant winds. As I watched, a pale figure moved amongst the shadowed darkness around their trunks. I felt a tightness around my chest as I thought of the woman in the bathroom, but when I looked again the shape had gone. Shivering, I quickly followed Dad, and we walked back to the hotel. In the Forest Lodge reception, Dad stopped to read some of the leaflets on the desk, leaving me to look around. High on one wall, I saw a painting of an older couple standing in front of the lodge. They were dressed in formal clothes that made me think of black and white films, and pictures I had seen in history books. The little plaque attached to the picture read, Charles and Alicia Rose, 1920. "They're a grumpy-looking pair, aren't they?" said a voice from over my shoulder, making me jump. Turning, I saw the man who had checked us in last night. "Who are they?" I asked, intrigued. The couple looked so formal and so miserable that I wanted to know more about them. "They're the people who built Forest Lodge, the Roses. They were here until 1920 when they sold the place to my granddad. Their daughter's picture is in the room you and your dad are in." "She died when she was quite young, didn't she?" I said, remembering the dates on the plaque. "She vanished," said the man, "in 1919. The Roses hoped for months that she'd come back. They organised search parties, dragged the lake, did everything they could. Eventually they found her dress ripped up in the forest. The police said that she'd probably been attacked by a soldier, come back from the war, and that he'd buried her somewhere or weighted her down and thrown her in the lake. The Roses left a couple of years after. She's never been found." I thought of the woman in my room and shuddered. The man, seeing my reaction, said, "Don't panic, son. There are no soldiers around here now, and even if there were, they're a peaceful lot." He grinned, but I could not smile in return. The evening was an uncomfortable one. Dad and I ate in the hotel restaurant. We did not talk much as we ate, and when we did, we avoided the subject of home. I wanted to ask when we were going back. This had been the longest we had ever been away, and I found, to my surprise, that I missed my mother. I missed the way she organised things so that I did not need to think. With her, things just seemed to happen before I even knew that I wanted them to. Dad was moody and difficult to predict, where she was, at least, consistent. With him I was unsure of what he wanted from me. To be quiet? To talk to him? To be his companion? To be his son? What he expected of me changed often, and without warning, and I had grown tired of it and wanted to be home. At least there I knew my place and my role. After our meal, we went back to the room, where Dad soon fell asleep. He snored gently as he slept, his mouth open. Even as it got dark, I did not turn the light on for fear of disturbing him. Besides, I had nothing to read even if there had been light. Instead, I got into bed and tried to rest. Had I really seen a woman in the bathroom, or had I, as Dad thought, simply let my own anxieties twist the picture I had seen of Charlotte Rose into a nightmare? I did not know. She had looked real, to be sure, but what proof was that? And if what I had seen was real, what precisely was it? A mad woman? A burglar? The ghost of Charlotte Rose come for some terrible, unimaginable revenge? No, I told myself, there were no ghosts here. Only a sleeping man and a young boy who was homesick and wanted his mother, but did not like to admit it. Even with my reassurances to myself, I did not find it easy to fall asleep that night. The sounds of the room settling around me changed, became the quiet tread of Charlotte as she came for me, her arms outstretched and her face covered apart from that one glaring eye. When I tried to blink the image away, it persisted, first hiding in the shadows by the door, then stalking toward me, now leaning over the end of my bed. Eventually I buried my head in my pillow and squeezed my eyes shut, and I suppose I must, at some point, have fallen asleep. Dad was in a better mood the next day, and decided that we were going to go for a walk, so that we could both enjoy our new outdoor clothes. He was cheerful and talkative, and kept me amused as we walked by telling me about things that he and my mother had done before they were married. "We used to laugh all the time," he said, "and go dancing. Your mother, she was light on her feet, and I used to feel so clumsy next to her, like I was a great elephant treading all over things. As he talked, we went around the end of the lake, hugging the shoreline, and then followed a trail away from the shore and into the trees. Here the clear air that blew in across the water was softened and thickened by the smell of pine and earth and moss. The sun came to us as a fractured thing, reaching the ground in patches that shifted and stretched as the tree branches moved above us. Fallen leaves and needles crackled and squelched beneath our feet as we walked. The sound of the wind caressing the trees and of animal life was above us and around us and ever present. Finally the trail brought us to a clearing on a hillside with a wooden bench and picnic table settled in its centre, and we sat and ate our lunch, looking out over a view that took in the lake and the forest below us, and the open farmland on the lake's far shore. As we sat and ate, Dad carried on talking, now about the things he and Mother would do to get on better. I stopped listening as I had heard many of them before, but it did not matter. I think he was talking more to himself anyway. Chewing on my last sandwich, I looked around me. The trail we had come up stretched out from one side of the clearing and continued from the other, sloping down back towards the lake. I was trying to gauge how far we had come and how far we might have to go, when something pale moved in amongst the trees. At first I thought it was a dog, or possibly a sheep, but it could not be. It was too tall. Besides, there was something stealthy about the way it slipped from behind one tree trunk to behind another, as though it was taking care to be as unobtrusive as possible. I immediately thought of Charlotte Rose, of the woman in the bathroom the night before, and gasped. I stood, peering along the path at where I had seen the movement. I wanted to tell Dad, but my voice froze. I felt him stand next to me and looked at him, so grateful that I felt sick. He had seen, I thought, and was looking. But he was not. Instead, he was picking up our litter and saying, "You're ready to go, are you? Okay then, off we trot." I watched, horrified, as he went towards the path and the pale shape beyond. "Can't we go back this way?" I said desperately, waving my hand behind me. "No, we cannot, lazybones," he said, laughing, and continued to walk. Then he was on the path, and I had no choice but to follow him, or be left alone. In amongst the trees, it was as though night had started to fall. Shadows lay across the ground, and drew at my legs as I chased after Dad. I was aware of thick, dark trunks hemming me in on both sides. Despite seeing nothing in that glowering darkness, I did not stop to wonder whether the figure was real. It was. A solid whiteness in the gloom that had slipped from tree to tree as I watched. I wanted to believe that it was gone, but I did not. The air was colder here, a chill that slithered across my flesh. I could feel that we were being watched, stared at, and that whoever was there was keeping pace with us in the trees. There was a pale flash to my side, gone as quickly as it came. I saw someone, dressed in white, moving between the trees. The figure was closer now, close enough for me to see it was the woman from the room, moving alongside us, and nearer. I saw a flapping pale cloth, and then she was gone again. Another glimpse, and the air grew colder. My breath fogged in front of me. The woman stepped out from behind a tree only feet away, and now I could make out her shape, see the way the cloth had started to unwrap itself from her head and hang down across her shoulder. She was moving quickly without seeming to, her dirt-streaked arms hanging by her side, and she was still barefoot. The sheet caught on trunks and twigs as she passed, swirling out behind her. She was glaring at us, and I wanted to run, but did not. I knew that she would catch me, and that the only place of safety was with Dad. I gripped hold of his hand tightly, curling my fingers around his, and practically pulled at him to go faster. He would not speed up, and I was forced to walk with him as the woman came closer and closer to us, until she was darting from tree to tree along the path's edge at our side. Terrified, I tugged at Dad, but he appeared not to see her. I pulled again, and this time he responded. He stopped walking and turned to face me. "What's wrong?" he asked, crouching so that his face was level with mine. I tried to answer, but could not. Over his shoulder I saw the woman move silently onto the path, her eye a baleful gleam, almost lost in the material that hung around her face. I tried to speak, to warn Dad, but no sound came. Just as it had in the bathroom, the temperature dropped and my throat tightened. I could only watch as the woman walked along the path, her arms reaching out before her. Dad knelt, holding on to my shoulders and shaking me gently. "Simon, what is it? What's wrong?" he asked, his tone exasperated. I felt my jaw clench and my teeth grind together as the woman stopped just behind Dad. Her fingers were clawed, and her skin was a dank grey. I thought at first that she was reaching for Dad, that she was going to hook her hands around his head and yank him backwards, but she did not. Instead she stretched past him, her arms either side of his head. Dad did not move, and I could not understand it. Surely he could see her. Surely he could see the arms, the pale wrists and splayed hands with their broken nails and ground-in dirt. I was desperate for him to react, to see the woman, to defend me, but he did not. He simply shook me more violently, saying, "Simon, what on earth is wrong with you? For God's sake, son, will you please say something?" The woman's arms were around Dad's head, curling in front of his face but not touching him. Her hands came at me, tilted so that I could see again the cuts on her palms. They were still moist-looking, their depths dark and sullen. Her flesh looked puffy, as though the skin was swelling and pulling away from her bones. I felt a wave of coldness roll over me. My skin contracted into prickles at the touch of the chill air, and I reared back as far as Dad's hold on me would allow. Behind him, the woman's wrapped head bent forward as though she were going to kiss him on the cheek. Everything seemed to have fallen silent. No birds sang in the trees, no wind moved through the forest. Dad had stopped talking. I wanted to look away, but could not. I looked at the woman, wanting to scream, but still unable to, and in that moment her eyes seemed to fill the whole of my sight. It was a dull glitter, recessed into the folds of cloth, and rimmed by red, cracked flesh. The socket around the eye was grey and soft-looking, and when the woman blinked I saw that her eyelid was swollen, stained the colour of old bruises. A tear, thick and gummy and dark, rolled down from her eye as she looked at me. It left a broken streak across her skin before trickling out of sight behind the folds of cloth. For a moment the swollen outline of her face looked familiar, as though I had seen it somewhere before. The hands came closer, the woman leaning further over Dad's shoulder. Her fingers flexed as though she was desperate to grasp me. The cold intensified, and with it came the smell of old water, and something else, something rotten and earthy. I saw the ragged edges of the broken nails as the fingers moved, bent and ripped. With a final thrust, she was upon me. Her fingers brushed against my cheek, and they were as cold as anything I have ever felt. The flesh moved unpleasantly below the skin of her fingertips as she tried to grip me, shifting as though there was a layer of grease between it and the bone. I took another wild step back, pulling Dad with me as I went. He stumbled and let go of me, falling on all fours on the packed and cold earth of the forest track. I took another couple of stumbled steps, and then my foot caught in something and I fell. I saw the sky pinwheeling above me, and then I hit the ground hard enough to drive the breath out of me. I lay wheezing and waited for the woman to take hold of me. It was Dad who I saw next, not the woman. He gripped me by the shoulders, looking frightened as he pulled me to my feet. I thought it was because he had seen the woman, but it quickly became clear that he hadn't. He ran his hand across my head and arms, asking continually, "Does it hurt?" His near panic was oddly comforting. giving me the sense that some things in the world were still normal. Dad still loved me and cared about me, even if the woman wished me harm. This sense of safety did not last long, however. Dad, seeing that I was okay, began to lose his temper with me. "What were you playing at?" he demanded, and when I did not answer immediately, he said angrily, "I thought we were supposed to be having a good time together. Why did you try to run away from me? You could have hurt yourself, and you scratched your cheek. For God's sake, tell me, what's wrong?" And I could not tell him. I wanted to. Of course I did. He was my dad, and I wanted to believe he could make everything all right. Only this time I did not think he could. He had not believed I had seen the woman the first time, had not seen the woman even when she was leaning over him and her arms were reaching for me from either side of his head. And if he could not see her, how could he protect me from her? How could my parents protect me at all? My mother, the endless worrier, was not even with me. My dad, the great adventurer, could not sense the danger even when it brushed up against him. I was alone. "What's wrong?" Dad said again, growing angrier. This, too, I had seen before, Dad growing angry when things interrupted his plans, especially things that he considered to be trivial, or he could not understand. The part of his personality that made him run from arguments also made him quick-tempered when running was not an option. He could not leave me, so he became angry, and his anger was hot and fast and sharp. I knew from experience that the only way to avoid it was to provide some form of explanation, to mollify him. "I'm sorry," I said. "I thought I saw something in the forest, and it frightened me." "Saw something? What?" "I don't know. A sheep, maybe," I said, telling my dad the first outright lie I had ever told him. "Then why did it frighten you?" he demanded. "I don't know. I think it reminded me of what happened in the bathroom, and I got scared." "Oh, son," Dad said, gathering me into an irritable hug. "You have to learn to relax a little, to take things easy. You'll be just like your mother if you carry on like this, a nervous wreck." I said nothing, savouring his hug and the way his arms wrapped around me like strong bars. The temperature rose again in the centre of the hug, and my scared flesh relaxed. Just for a moment, I felt safe. The journey back to Forest Lodge was not a pleasant one. Dad, his day spoiled, was still angry, and he walked fast, one hand clamped around my left wrist and tugging whenever I started to fall behind. He ignored my attempts at conversation, keeping his eyes focused ahead of us on the path and saying nothing. As we went, I thought I saw a white shape flitting between the trees to our side. I did not know if it was the woman, but we were moving so fast that it did not seem to matter, and she came no closer, if it were her. Finally the ground fell away on that side, becoming a steep gully with a thin stream trickling along its bottom, and the white thing vanished. When I stumbled and went close to the edge, Dad yanked me hard away and swore at me, telling me not to go too near the water. As we walked, I tried to think about what had happened to me over the previous days. Twice now the woman had appeared. Who was she? What did she want? Was it Charlotte Rose, come back to take her revenge? If so, why on me? It made no sense, but I had no other explanation. The pretty girl in the flowing white dress who had died, or at least vanished, so young, was coming for me, and I had no idea why. Returning to our room was a comfort. The great fireplace and dark wood of the beds had a solidity that drove away some of my fears. How could ghosts exist here, in a room where everything was so solid and heavy? Even seeing my face in the mirror, and realizing that the woman's fingers had left their mark, like old blisters across my cheek, did not feel too frightening. Strangely, it was almost reassuring. If she had marked me, then the woman was real, and not my imagination. I discovered that I was exhausted after the events of the walk, and lay on my bed, hoping that Dad would calm down and talk to me. He did not. He sat on the sofa and gazed into the distance, the clenching and unclenching of his fists his only movement, and the crack of his knuckles the only sound. I wanted to fix the situation, say something to him, tell him that I was sorry for lying, that it was not a sheep I saw, but a woman I thought might be the dead Charlotte Rose. I wanted to ask him to keep a careful watch out for her, but dared not. I did not know what words to use. Wanting to stay awake, I instead found myself asleep within minutes. Dad woke me later, his face back to cheery normality. "I've had some food sent up for supper," he said, "and crisps and drinks." On the coffee table were plates heavy with sandwiches, glasses of juice, and a bowl of crisps. I found that I was hungry, and was soon sat with Dad, eating the food and enjoying the rich, dense flavours of cheese and fresh butter and bread still warm from the oven. Dad talked non-stop as we ate, and I was glad his mood had improved whilst I slept. He made no mention of our walk, concentrating instead on the things we could do in the forthcoming days. I wanted to ask if we could go home, get away from this place and its shrouded ghost, but did not. Dad was planning, and I knew from experience that I would not be able to divert him from these plans. Besides, his good mood was new and delicate. The slightest disagreement could damage it, make it melt into something darker and less pleasant. "Would it be okay with you if I went out?" asked Dad, as soon as he had finished his meal. He stood, clearly anticipating that I would say yes. I was so surprised that I didn't speak. "Go out? Where?" "I'll only be an hour or two. I just thought I'd go for a drink in the bar downstairs, so I won't be far, and you can come and get me if there are any problems. You'll be fine, though, won't you? You're not a child now, after all." And then, before I could say anything, he was gone. Perhaps I should have tried harder to stop him, said something, said anything to make him stay, but I didn't. I wanted him to be there with me, but I also wanted him to know this without being asked, and his inability to see what I needed from him hurt me in a way that I had not been hurt before. I suddenly saw my dad as a selfish creature, one who disliked not getting his own way, and I felt hopeless after he had gone. He took my strength with him as he left, and for a time afterwards I simply sat on the sofa and cried. I stopped crying when it began to hurt my head. Wiping my eyes and my nose on my sleeve, I looked up at the painting of Charlotte Rose. In the creeping shadows of evening, her face was pale, and her dress a light patch against the dark background. "What do you want?" I whispered, feeling helpless and angry. "Why can't you leave me alone?" The figure in the painting didn't reply. Feeling my tears build again, I looked away. Swathed in dirty material, the woman was seated on the sofa next to me. This time I screamed. Without thinking and still screaming, I threw myself away from her along the sofa. Its low, out-curled arm caught me in the small of my back, and my momentum carried me over in a tumble of flailing limbs. The room whirled around me, then the floor caught me in its hard embrace, and I was lying sprawled, my head partially under the sofa. I shuffled out from under it, wriggling furiously and pulling myself along, my hands digging into the thick carpet. As I came out, I saw the woman looking at me from over the arm of the sofa, the grimy sheet untwisting itself from around her face. Dried dirt flaked away from the material and fell onto my face and into my eyes. Blinking and crying, my screams now little more than hoarse exhalations, carried on air that was rapidly chilling, I rolled over onto my front and began to crawl. Terrified that the woman would catch me if I stopped moving, even for a moment, I bumped into the table as I crawled by, but felt no pain as it jolted into my shoulder. The table wobbled, and a cup fell off it and landed on the floor in front of me. Knocking it aside, I crawled on. Although I could hear nothing except my own wailing breath, I imagined her following me, this terrible creature whose purpose I could not understand. And I crawled faster. Once past the table and the sofa, I was in the open space between the furniture and the door, which stood in mute offer of escape. I felt exposed and vulnerable on my hands and knees, and, still moving forwards, pushed myself up into a headlong stagger. I tripped as I came close to the door, falling back to my knees before it. Reaching out, I grasped the doorknob and tried to turn it, but my hands, wet with terror, slithered over its brass surface helplessly. I tried again, but was still unable to gain purchase. Weeping, I felt the woman's hand touch my cheek, brushing her cold fingertips against the mark that she had already left upon me. Jerking away, I tightened my grip and twisted. Feeling the embossed pattern pressing into my palms, I managed to open the door and used it to support myself as I got to my feet and ran. I had taken only a couple of strides when a hand gripped my shoulder. It was not a strong grip, and I broke it by thrashing my arm around wildly, but doing so made me stumble once more, and I fell heavily against the far wall of the landing and then to the floor. Rolling onto my back, I saw the woman walk through the doorway, the greying sheet swinging around her and her arms outstretched. I think I may have screamed again. I wanted my dad very badly then, wanted to be wrapped in his arms and protected by him, wanted to have him see the woman and force her to leave me alone, and I got to my feet as quickly as I could and ran for the stairs. The staircase was wide, and, in the subdued lighting of the hotel's evening, gloomy. It bent back on itself halfway down, becoming a mezzanine balcony lined with pictures, before turning again and continuing down into the foyer. From the top step the shadows looked rich and heavy, and as I ran down, I felt as if I were sinking into dark water. The wood of the banister was dark, smooth to the touch, from the caress of countless hands over the years, and I clung to it as I descended. The thick carpet swallowed the sound of my feet, and I could hear my sobbing, and the squeak of my hand along the varnished wood. I thought I felt the air freeze about me, puckering my skin with its chill touch. I ran, and it felt as though the woman clutched at me every step. I imagined hands grasping at my shoulders, fingers twisting themselves through my hair and pinching at the flesh of my cheek, nails digging into the exposed flesh of my neck. The pain of these assaults was as real as the throbbing in my face where she had touched me, and yet, when I reached the mezzanine and turned, the woman was still at the top of the stairs. She stood in the centre of the top step, looking down at me. Her hands hung at her sides, and her head was bowed. Her shoulders were shaking, a movement I took for mirth. She was enjoying this, enjoying the fear she was creating in me, and I hated her then more than I have hated anyone before or since. I ran on. The people in the pictures looked on, impassive, as I dashed past them. I wondered if these were more pictures of Charlotte Rose's parents, or other family members or friends. Would she stop and look at them as she walked by, or would she simply ignore them and continue after me? Would their formal, composed faces sadden her? Would it anger her to see them, to be reminded of her lost life? What was it she wanted from me? The foyer was empty, except for the leather armchairs lining its walls. I stopped by the reception desk, wondering if I ought to ring the bell, but did not. Even if someone came, would they be able to see the woman? I did not think so. I simply wanted to be with my dad, have him gather me to him and make things right. Looking back, I saw the woman walking down the stairs, stepping into the brighter light of the foyer. Her ankles and calves were grey and swollen. Vivid purple marks had crept across her feet, and the sheet was unravelling itself from around her body as she came on, so that one arm and shoulder were exposed. There were more purple marks here, and other blacker patches. The sheet dropped further, revealing one darkened, muddy breast, and even in my fear I felt embarrassment at seeing her exposed like that. I could feel waves of fear and hate and desperation coming off her, and the air became cold as she came closer. I wanted to scream at her, ask her what she wanted. What she was doing made no sense to me. She had had ample opportunity to hurt me, but hadn't. Apart from the mark on my cheek, I remained unharmed. Why chase and chase and chase me? Or was it just the chase itself that mattered? The fear she could make me feel by appearing and disappearing and appearing again? Why me? I did not know, and felt helpless in the face of my ignorance. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I crossed the foyer and went on. I went to find my dad. Forest Lodge's bar was at the end of a short, dark corridor. It was separated from the rest of the hotel by a heavy, glass-panelled door, and as I came closer I could see Dad through the glass. The thick panels had a pattern etched into them which distorted the way Dad looked, stretched him and made him angular and thin. Sat at the bar talking to the barman, he looked like a stranger. The barman said something to Dad and the two men laughed. A harsh sound unlike the way Dad laughed when he was with me, and I paused at the door without opening it. I could see my reflection in the glass. Then a pale smear moved behind me, and the woman's face, with its sagging sheet wrapping, appeared above my shoulder. Arms wrapped themselves around me and pulled me away from the door. I felt them tighten against my stomach and chest. I felt the soft flesh shift across her bones as her grip tightened, and my flesh prickled and contracted. I tensed, expecting something awful to happen, but it didn't. The woman pulled me tight against her, and I felt the rough tremble of the cloth as it dangled from her head and lay against the dark side of my face. Her arms were cold, even through my shirt, and I could smell her. A sickly odour of mildew and earth and something spoiled and old. Reflected in the glass, I saw that she was staring straight ahead. She glared, and her eye, its surrounding flesh dark and swollen, narrowed. I could sense the fury in her, but I also sensed fear and did not understand. I was frightened, but why should she be? Through the glass I saw Dad lift his drink, his head tilting back as he swallowed. The woman's arms tightened around me, squeezing my chest. I tried to beg her to stop, but all that came out was a wheeze. I saw her head twitch when she heard it, and then turn towards me. The reflected eye seemed to change and soften as it focused on me, and her arm loosened their grip. She tilted her head as she turned, so that more of the sheet untwisted itself and drifted loose. I heard the crackle of dried stains shifting and breaking as the sheet moved. The lower half of the woman's face was uncovered now, revealing blackened lips and skin that was grey and puffy. She lowered her face towards mine, and I tried to move away, but couldn't. The woman's arms held me firm. Perhaps she means to eat me, I thought, as her face came against mine. However, with lips that were warm and soft and gentle, she kissed my cheek, and the painful throb from the mark she had left on me earlier immediately faded. Then, letting her arms fall away from me, she stepped back. As she did so, the sheet came completely away from her head, and I saw her face. Before I could speak, she had vanished into the shadows of the corridor. When I turned, she had gone. I do not clearly remember the next few minutes. I felt oddly detached from what was happening, as though I were watching it happen to someone else. I was not thinking exactly, but simply going over and over the events of the previous days in my head, trying to see them differently. I must have walked back down the little corridor and into the foyer, for the next thing I knew I was sat in one of the comfortable leather chairs, watching as cold blue light swept across the floor and up the walls. The light jolted me and made me blink, and I looked around to see 2 policemen come in through Forest Lodge's front door and go to the reception desk. One was about to ring the bell for attention when the other, older policeman, shook his head and turned the hotel's register towards him. After a few moments checking something, the policeman went up the stairs. I did not wonder where they were going. I think I already knew. The policemen were only gone a couple of minutes before they reappeared, this time moving with a little more urgency. The older one saw me as they came down the stairs and looked as though he were about to stop and talk to me, but the other one ran straight past and down the corridor to the bar. The older man followed. I heard shouts and a crash, and then the 2 policemen came back out into the foyer, dragging my dad between them. He was handcuffed and crying out, hoarse roars of fury and foul language mixing in a loud mess of words. He struggled and pulled at his captors, but stopped when he saw me. "Simon, I'm sorry," he said. "I never meant." And then he was gone from the foyer, and I was alone. The elder of the 2 policemen returned after a few minutes and came over to sit by me. He looked friendly, and he had a comforting smell to him of aftershave and soap and solidity. "Son," he said quietly, "I know you just saw us take your dad away, and you must be wondering why. It shouldn't be me that tells you this, but then you shouldn't have had to see that at all. I'm afraid I have some bad news for you." He seemed to expect a response from me, so I nodded at him. "There's no other way to say this, so I'm just going to say it. Your mother's dead." Hearing it said like that, even when I was so sure I already knew what he was going to say, made my stomach ache and my vision blur. Reality, the truth of things, came upon me in a nauseous wave, and I only half heard the policeman as he carried on speaking. "I know you must feel bad now, but you may as well know it all. It'll be in the papers soon enough, and better you hear it from me than read it or hear it from some reporter shouting questions at you in the street. We think that on Monday after you went to school, your mum and dad carried on arguing. They'd been arguing a lot that weekend, hadn't they?" I nodded. "We think that your dad lost his temper with your mum and hit her a lot, and then he killed her. Perhaps he didn't mean to kill her, but he did. It looks like he panicked afterwards and wrapped your mum in a sheet from their bed. He went to some woods near your home and threw her into a stream before picking you up from school and bringing you here. We found her body a few hours ago. I'm sorry, son. Maybe it should have been someone else who told you, but there's no one here but me." Tears came then, and I leant against the solid policeman and hugged him. I had known when I saw the ghost's face, but had not wanted it to be true. I cried and cried, for me and my dad, but mostly for my mum. I wished that I had understood better, that I had not been so frightened. I wished that she had been able to talk to me, let me know what she wanted and how she felt. That she had not been as scared of my dad. I wished that I had had longer with her. I wished that I had known that a dark hotel corridor was where I would see my mother for the last time, and that the lips of a ghost on my cheek were her goodbye kiss.